In the glittering literary world of 1920s London, Rosamond Lehmann was a superstar. With a best-selling, scandalous first novel, she became the voice of a generation, a celebrated beauty, and a writer who was acquainted and socialized with some friends within the Bloomsbury circle. Her life seemed destined for greatness, but behind the glamorous facade, her story was one of staggering emotional turmoil. This is the story of a life defined by two catastrophic love affairs and one unthinkable tragedy. It's about how a 9-year secret relationship with the poet Cecil Day Lewis ended in a brutal public humiliation that nearly destroyed her. It's about how she transformed that agony into her greatest masterpiece, only to be struck down by a loss so absolute, the sudden death of her beloved daughter, Sally, that it silenced her as a novelist forever. Rosamond Lehmann's journey took her from literary sensation to a recluse who sought solace in the world of mediums and spirits, becoming the ultimate Swan out of favor. Her life is a powerful exploration of the immense cost of feeling everything, the brutal collision of art and life, and the desperate search for meaning when all the lights have gone out. To understand the woman Rosamond would become, her genius, her passions, her vulnerabilities, we have to begin in the world that made her. A world that has now vanished so completely, it feels more like a dream than a memory. She was born in 1901, a child of the Edwardian era, a time that has been mythologized as a long golden afternoon just before the cataclysmic storm of the First World War. For a privileged family like hers, it was an age of supreme confidence, of garden parties and intellectual pursuits, a world governed by intricate rules of etiquette and class. But beneath that polished surface, it was also a world of rigid expectations and profound emotional reservation, especially for women. Her childhood home was the crucible where her personality was forged. It was called Fieldhead, a sprawling romantic house near the Thames in Bourne End, Buckinghamshire. It wasn't a grand aristocratic estate, but something more unique, a vibrant, chaotic, and utterly enchanting bubble of creativity and liberal intellectualism. The house itself was a character in the lives of the Lehmann children, a place of endless gardens that sloped down to the river, of secret corners perfect for reading, of a library overflowing with books, and of rooms filled with the constant hum of conversation and debate. Fieldhead was a haven, an incubator for talent, and in some ways, a gilded cage. Presiding over this domain were two very different and equally formative parents. Her father, Rudolph Chambers Lehmann, known to everyone as R.C., was the sun around which the family orbited. The son of a German immigrant and a Scottish mother, he was the embodiment of the successful Edwardian gentleman, charming, witty, and prodigiously talented in multiple fields. He was a celebrated writer and journalist, known for his witty and satirical contributions to Punch magazine. He was also a Liberal member of Parliament, a passionate sportsman who had rowed for Cambridge and coached their legendary boat crew, and a man who seemed to know everyone worth knowing in London's political and literary spheres. To his 4 children, he was a magical, if somewhat remote, figure. He was the parent who organized elaborate games, who encouraged their creative endeavors, and who filled the house with laughter and fascinating people. But his warmth was a general, broadcast warmth, not a focused, intimate affection. He adored his children as a group, as a testament to his own successful life, but he was often lost in his own world of work, politics, and socializing. Rosamond craved his approval desperately, and this early experience of loving a charming, brilliant, but ultimately elusive man would echo tragically throughout her adult life. The other pole of the household was her mother, Alice Davis. If R.C. was the sun, Alice was the cool, formidable moon. An American heiress from a puritanical New England background, she was a striking beauty who never quite shed her American formality. Where her husband was relaxed and sociable, Alice was reserved, disciplined, and deeply concerned with propriety. She was the one who managed the chaotic household, who enforced the rules, and who held emotion at a careful, almost clinical distance. She loved her children, but expressed it through duty and management rather than hugs and kisses. In her memoirs, Rosamond would remember her mother's cool, critical, appraising glance, a look that could quell any outburst of unseemly emotion. This maternal coolness, this lesson that intense feeling was something to be controlled and concealed, created in Rosamond a deep and insatiable hunger for passionate, demonstrative love. Into this dynamic, 4 remarkable children were born. There was the eldest, Helen, Rosamond, the second daughter and the acknowledged beauty, Beatrix, a year younger, a fiery, dramatic girl who would go on to become a well-known stage and screen actress, and finally the adored youngest, John, who would become a significant poet and publisher, founding the influential New Writing magazine. The Lehmann children were not raised so much as cultivated. They were a tribe unto themselves, fiercely competitive and intensely close. Their intellectual diet was richer than their emotional one. Denied easy parental intimacy, they turned to each other and to the world of imagination. They created their own private universe at Fieldhead, staging elaborate theatricals and producing their own family magazine, cheekily titled The Fieldhead Tatler, for which Rosamond wrote her first precocious stories and poems. Their days were a strange mixture of freedom and structure. They were free to roam the idyllic countryside, to read anything they wanted from their father's vast library, to absorb the high-minded conversations of the adults who flowed through the house. But they were also bound by the strictures of their class and time, by nannies, governesses, and their mother's insistence on good form. It was this contradiction, the internal world of immense imaginative freedom, clashing with an external world of emotional restraint, that would become the central theme of Rosamond's fiction. Her novels are filled with young women who feel everything, but are trapped in circumstances that forbid them from showing it. They were, in essence, all versions of herself. This Edwardian bubble, however, could not last. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 shattered the serene confidence of their world. Although the Lehmann family was physically safe, the war cast a long shadow. The anti-German hysteria of the time made their German surname a source of anxiety. More profoundly, the war wiped out a generation of young men, including many friends of the family, and irrevocably altered the social landscape of Britain. The old certainties were gone. For a young woman like Rosamond, coming of age in the war's aftermath, the world felt both more dangerous and more open. The traditional path of a lady of her class, a quiet debut, a suitable marriage, a life of domesticity, no longer seemed the only option. A new world was dawning, and Rosamond, armed with a fierce intelligence and a heart full of unexpressed longing, was ready to step into it. Her destination was Cambridge. For a young woman of Rosamond's intellect and temperament, leaving the family cocoon of Fieldhead for Girton College, Cambridge, in 1919 was like stepping out of a dimly lit room into the brilliant sunshine. Girton was one of the first residential colleges for women, a place of serious academic rigor that existed as a kind of tolerated, semi-detached island in the vast, ancient, and overwhelmingly male sea of Cambridge University. Here, for the first time, Rosamond was not just R.C. Lehmann's beautiful daughter. She was a formidable mind in her own right, judged on her own merits. She blossomed. She excelled in her studies of English literature, but it was the social and intellectual life that truly ignited her. Cambridge, in the years after the Great War, was a place of feverish energy, a generation that had survived the slaughter was determined to live, to think, to love with a new and desperate intensity. The old Victorian and Edwardian rules were being gleefully thrown overboard. In this intoxicating atmosphere, Rosamond, with her striking, rather melancholy beauty, those huge, dark, expressive eyes, her flawless skin, and an air of quiet, watchful intensity, became a sensation. She was quickly drawn into the most elite and intimidating intellectual circles, most notably the orbit of the Bloomsbury group and its Cambridge associates. While the secret society known as the Apostles was exclusively male, she socialized in the same Cambridge intellectual circles as some of its influential members, figures who were also associated with Bloomsbury, like Lytton Strachey and E. M. Forster. These were the intellectual titans of the age. The economist John Maynard Keynes, the biographer Lytton Strachey, the writer E. M. Forster. To be accepted by them was the ultimate validation. Lytton Strachey, a man famous for his withering wit, captured the effect Rosamond had on this circle. According to a popular anecdote, upon first meeting her, he turned to a friend and declared, with a mixture of admiration and dismissiveness, "We have a new beauty." The comment was telling. She was, first and foremost, seen as a beautiful object, an ornamental addition to their world. But they quickly discovered that behind the beauty was a sharp, perceptive, and often fiercely determined intellect. She could hold her own in their dazzlingly clever and often cruel verbal games. Yet Cambridge was also the place where her emotional education began, and it was a painful and confusing one. It was here that the pattern for her future romantic disasters was set. She found herself drawn to brilliant, charismatic, and often deeply narcissistic young men who were captivated by her beauty, but were either unwilling or unable to return the depth of feeling she offered. She experienced her first tastes of love and heartbreak, discovering that the intellectual intimacy she shared with these men rarely translated into reliable emotional connection. This chasm between intellectual communion and emotional fulfillment would haunt her, and it became the foundational subject of her fiction. Just as significant were the intense, passionate, and deeply complicated friendships she formed with other young women at Girton. In the single-sex environment of the college, emotional attachments between students were common and accepted, existing in a nebulous space between platonic friendship and romantic love. These relationships were often more emotionally satisfying and stable than her dalliances with men. They were relationships of shared confidences, intellectual excitement, and profound emotional support. It was this complex, emotionally charged world of female friendship, with all its ambiguities, jealousies, and deep affections, that she would later mine with such revolutionary honesty for her first novel. By the time she graduated in 1922 with an excellent degree, Rosamond Lehmann stood at a crossroads. Her Cambridge years had given her a powerful sense of her own intellectual worth and a tantalizing taste of personal freedom. They had awakened her mind and her senses, but they had also left her with a profound and aching emotional hunger. The world she was stepping into still expected a woman like her, no matter how brilliant, to follow a single preordained path. Society demanded marriage. And Rosamond, despite her burgeoning independence, was still a product of her time, still a daughter who sought approval, still a young woman who yearned for the security and a grand passion she had only read about in books. The man who appeared to offer this conventional security was Walter Leslie Runciman. He was the handsome, charming, and eminently respectable heir to a vast shipping fortune. To her family and to the world, he was a perfect match. Stable, wealthy, and from the same upper-class background. In 1923, she accepted his proposal. She was doing what was expected of her, what every girl in her position was supposed to want. She was about to become Mrs. Runciman, the wife of a shipping magnate, the mistress of a grand house. But in choosing this path, she was also walking into the first great cage of her life, a period of profound unhappiness that would, by a stroke of creative alchemy, provide the catalyst for her to finally channel her memories of Cambridge and youth into her first great work. The Swan was about to have her wings clipped. In the fairy tales of her youth, a brilliant young woman who marries a handsome and wealthy heir is supposed to live happily ever after. This is the end of the story. For Rosamond Lehmann, it was the beginning of a sentence. Her marriage to Leslie Runciman in 1923 was not an emotional union. It was a transaction, a bowing to convention that she would almost immediately regret. The couple moved north to Newcastle upon Tyne, where the Runciman family's vast shipping empire was based. For a woman whose entire being had been nurtured by beauty, art, and intellectual fire, the move was a brutal shock to the system. Imagine the contrast. She had come from the lush green Thames Valley and the hallowed, whispering courtyards of Cambridge. She was now in a city built on coal and steel, under a sky often gray with industrial smoke. The landscape itself was a reflection of her inner state. She was plunged into the provincial high society of Tyneside, a world of business dinners, formal calls, and polite surface-level conversations. It was a world that valued wealth and status above all else, a world that had little time or understanding for a young woman who wanted to discuss poetry, philosophy, and the intricate workings of the human heart. Her husband, Leslie, was not a cruel man. In many ways, he was a victim of the same rigid class expectations that had trapped her. He was kind, dutiful, and utterly devoted to his work and his position, but he was completely, hopelessly bewildered by his new wife. He could not comprehend her deep-seated melancholy, her intellectual restlessness, or her desperate need for a level of emotional and spiritual connection that he was simply not equipped to provide. He gave her a beautiful home, expensive clothes, and financial security. He could not understand why that wasn't enough. For Rosamond, it was a beautiful, perfectly appointed, and suffocatingly empty cage. She was profoundly, achingly lonely. In letters home, she wrote of the appalling inertia that had taken hold of her, of a sterility and deadness that seemed to seep into her very bones. She felt invisible, her true self, hidden away behind the mask of Mrs. Runciman, the charming hostess. This period of intense isolation, however, had an unintended consequence. It turned her into a meticulous observer. Like an anthropologist stranded in a foreign land, she began to watch, to listen, to dissect the subtle codes, the unspoken tensions, and the quiet desperations of the people around her. She saw the lives of other women trapped in similar marriages, and she recognized their silent suffering. This loneliness, this feeling of being an outsider looking in, sharpened her perceptions and gave her the raw material for her art. It was in this state of quiet desperation, in the long, empty hours in her grand, silent house, that she began to write, not as a genteel hobby, as some ladies of her class did, but as an urgent, secret act of rebellion and reclamation. Writing was her escape route. It was the only place where she could be her true self, where she could revisit the world where she had felt most alive, Cambridge. With no thought of publication purely for her own sanity, she began to pour all of her pent-up emotions, her nostalgia for the passionate friendships of her youth, her disillusionment with love and marriage, her intense longing for a life of meaning, onto the page. She was writing the book that would become Dusty Answer, The title itself, taken from a line by the poet George Meredith, spoke of her disillusionment. Ah, what a dusty answer gets the soul when hot for certainties in this our life. She worked in secret, hiding the manuscript away, convinced it was a purely private indulgence. But the creative force once unleashed could not be contained. After being encouraged by her circle of family and friends, she submitted the manuscript to the publishers Chatto and Windus, where it was accepted for publication. Rosamond did so with little hope, expecting a polite rejection. What happened next would detonate her quiet, unhappy life. The manuscript landed on the desk of an editor named C.H.C. Prentice, who recognized immediately that this was something extraordinary. He saw past the youthful romanticism to the searing honesty at its core. Chatto and Windus offered to publish it. In 1927, Dusty Answer was released into the world, and the world was electrified. The book wasn't just a success, it was a phenomenon, a literary explosion. It tells the story of Judith Earle, a sensitive, intelligent girl growing up next door to a captivating family of cousins. The novel follows her from a lonely childhood to her vibrant, emotionally charged years at Cambridge. It was there, in her depiction of university life, that Rosamond broke new ground. She wrote with breathtaking intimacy about Judith's intense, ambiguous, and deeply passionate relationships, not just with the elusive young men she falls for, but more powerfully with her fellow female students, particularly the brilliant and beautiful Jennifer. For the literary establishment and the older generation, the book was a scandal. Its frank exploration of a young woman's inner world, her desires, her disappointments, was considered unseemly. Its powerful depiction of the emotional and physical intensity of female friendships was seen as dangerously decadent, hinting at a lesbianism that was at the time the subject of intense social panic. The very year after Dusty Answer was published, Radcliffe Hall's explicitly lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, would be put on trial for obscenity. Rosamond had walked right up to the edge of that forbidden territory, and the shockwaves were immense. But if the establishment was shocked, the young were enthralled. A generation of readers, especially young women, saw themselves in Judith Earle. They recognized her yearning, her confusion, her feeling of being caught between a desire for romantic love and the powerful pull of female solidarity. Rosamond received thousands of letters from readers who felt she had told their own secret story. The book became a bestseller in both Britain and America. Overnight, Rosamond Lehmann, the lonely housewife from Newcastle, was transformed into an international literary celebrity. She was no longer just Mrs. Runciman. She was the voice of a generation. The success of Dusty Answer was the key that unlocked her cage. It gave her financial independence. It gave her a powerful new identity. And most crucially, it gave her the courage to admit that her marriage was a mistake and to seek a life that was true to the person she was now becoming. Her old life was over. A new, far more dangerous and exciting one was about to begin. And the man who would usher her into it was waiting in the wings. His name was Wogan Phillips, and he was everything Leslie Runciman was not. Where Leslie was a conservative pillar of the establishment, Wogan was a passionate rebel. He was the heir to a barony, an aristocrat by birth, but he had scandalized his family by rejecting his background to become a painter and a fervent, card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He was tall, impossibly charming, idealistic, and burned with a political and artistic fire that Rosamond found irresistible. He saw her not as a beautiful object or a society hostess, but as a fellow artist, a comrade in the rebellion against the stuffy, hypocritical world they had both been born into. They met shortly after Dusty Answer was published, and the attraction was immediate and overwhelming. For Rosamond, who had spent years starved of intellectual and emotional passion, meeting Wogan was like a dying plant being returned to the sun and rain. He represented life, art, freedom, and a love that was based on a meeting of minds and souls. A passionate affair began, and it gave Rosamond the final impetus she needed to end her marriage. The divorce from Leslie was a painful and public affair, a transgression that still carried a heavy social stigma in the late 1920s. But Rosamond was resolute. She had found what she believed to be the great love of her life, and she would not let him go. In 1928, she and Wogan married. They turned their backs on London society and the industrial north and created their own private kingdom in the heart of the English countryside. They settled in a beautiful, slightly ramshackle house in Little Wittenham, Oxfordshire. For a time it was a true idyll, the happy ending she had so desperately craved. These were her golden years. Life at Little Wittenham was everything her life in Newcastle had not been. The house was a hub of creative energy, filled with friends from the literary world, particularly figures connected to Bloomsbury, like the diarist Francis Partridge and the critic Raymond Mortimer. There were long drunken dinners filled with scintillating conversation, lazy afternoons spent by the river, and the constant joyous hum of a life dedicated to art and ideas. It was here that Rosamond's work reached its full maturity. No longer writing out of desperation, she now wrote from a place of confidence and creative command. In 1932, she published Invitation to the Waltz, a luminous and exquisitely rendered novel that follows 17-year-old Olivia Curtis over the course of a few days leading up to her first society dance. It is a masterpiece of nuance, capturing with heartbreaking precision the terrifying hopes, the crushing disappointments, and the secret inner world of a young girl on the cusp of adulthood. The book was a phenomenal success, cementing her reputation as one of the most important writers of her time. Her life was also now anchored by a new, profound love, motherhood. In 1929, her son, Hugo, was born, and in 1934, her daughter, Sarah, who was always known as Sally. Rosamond was a fiercely devoted and adoring mother. Her children, particularly Sally, became the absolute center of her emotional universe. She had found a pure, unconditional love that seemed to heal the wounds of her own emotionally restrained childhood. A few years later, she would publish what many consider her most daring work of this period, The Weather in the Streets. The novel, published in 1936, picks up the story of Olivia Curtis 10 years later. She is now a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage who embarks on a clandestine and ultimately devastating affair with a married man. The book was shocking for its time, not only for its frank depiction of adultery from the woman's point of view, but for its honest and non-judgmental handling of the then taboo subject of abortion. It was a brave, brilliant, and deeply moving book, a testament to her power as a novelist at the absolute peak of her form. Looking from the outside, Rosamond Lehmann's life in the mid-1930s seemed perfect. She was a critically acclaimed and best-selling author. She was the wife of a passionate, handsome man she adored. She was the mother of 2 beautiful children. She was the mistress of an idyllic country home that served as a magnet for the brightest minds in England. The unhappy Swan from Newcastle had found her paradise. She was gliding serenely at the center of her own perfect world. But the very forces that had brought her and Wogan together, their passionate, idealistic, and uncompromising natures, were already beginning to tear their perfect world apart. The rumblings of history were growing louder in Europe, and they would soon shake their private kingdom to its foundations. There is a cruel irony in the way great loves die. The very qualities that once drew two people together often become the very instruments that drive them apart. For Rosamond and Wogan Phillips, their shared passion for a life of meaning and authenticity had been their foundational bond. But as the 1930s wore on, their definitions of that life began to diverge so radically that they no longer seemed to inhabit the same reality. Wogan's idealism, which Rosamond had once found so romantic, began to harden into a rigid, unforgiving political dogma. His commitment to communism became less a philosophy and more a fundamentalist religion, demanding total adherence. In his new politically purified worldview, Rosamond's work, with its deep dive into the nuances of individual psychology and the complexities of love, was no longer profound. It was, in the stark vocabulary of the party, bourgeois, a frivolous distraction from the great material struggle of the classes. The artist who had adored her work now became its harshest critic. Their intimate conversations about literature and art were replaced by his political lectures, her emotional concerns dismissed as irrelevant self-indulgence. An ideological wall was being built between them, brick by painstaking brick. The final decisive blow came from Spain. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out, a brutal conflict between the elected Republican government and the fascist forces of General Franco. For a generation of left-wing idealists across Europe, this was not a foreign conflict. It was the defining battle of their time, the front line in the war against fascism. For Wogan, there was no question of standing by. He volunteered to go to Spain to drive an ambulance for the Republican cause. From Rosamond's perspective, his decision was a torment of contradictions. She felt a surge of pride in his courage and his commitment to his principles, but she was also gripped by a cold, visceral terror for his safety. And beneath both of those emotions was a growing, gnawing sense of abandonment. She was left behind in the Oxfordshire countryside with two small children, her life put on hold, her days consumed by anxiety, waiting for letters that were infrequent and emotionally distant. She was once again a lonely woman in a beautiful house, but this loneliness was sharper, more painful, because it was haunted by the ghost of a love that was actively dying. When Wogan eventually returned from Spain, he was a different man. He had been seriously wounded, but the deeper changes were internal. The horrors he had witnessed had stripped away the last vestiges of the charming bohemian artist she had married. He was now a hardened political soldier, more doctrinaire and emotionally remote than ever. The easy intimacy, the shared laughter, the very foundation of their marriage had been casualties of the war. They continued to live under the same roof at Little Wittenham for several more years, but it was a shared existence in name only. They were two strangers, orbiting each other in a cold, silent space, each a bitter disappointment to the other. By the time the Second World War engulfed Britain in 1939, Rosamond's personal world was already a landscape of ruins. She was entering her 40s, a celebrated author trapped in a loveless marriage, her heart a locked room waiting for someone to find the key. It was in this state of profound emotional vulnerability against the terrifying backdrop of the Blitz and a nation fighting for its survival that she met the man she would come to believe was her destiny, the great defining soulmate of her life. His name was Cecil Day-Lewis. In the landscape of English letters in 1941, he was a towering figure, a brilliant poet, a leading light of the so-called Auden generation that had revolutionized English poetry in the 1930s. He was a man of immense charm, wit, and intellectual prestige. He was, like Wogan, a one-time communist who had since moderated his views, and he was working for the Ministry of Information, crafting wartime propaganda. He was also, like Rosamond, married. He had a wife, Mary, and 2 young sons, and his marriage was, by all accounts, a difficult and unhappy one. They knew each other, as everyone in their world knew everyone else from literary parties and gatherings. But their real connection began when they were thrown together more frequently through their wartime work. It didn't start with a thunderclap of illicit passion, but with the slow, seductive burn of recognition. Here at last was a man who spoke her language. He was an artist, a creator, a man who understood that the inner world of emotion was not a frivolous distraction, but the very essence of human experience. Their conversations were the lifeblood she had been denied for years. They talked for hours about poetry, about novels, about the challenge of creating art in a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. For Rosamond, who had been living in an intellectual and emotional desert, Cecil's attention was like water. He saw her, he understood her, he valued her in a way her own husband no longer did. The slide from deep friendship into passionate love felt both inevitable and terrifying. And so began the central and most catastrophic love affair of her life. It was a clandestine relationship that would last for 9 years, a secret that would consume her and define the entire middle period of her life. From the very beginning, their affair was predicated on what Rosamond firmly believed to be a foundational promise. In her letters from this period, Rosamond makes it clear she believed in what she perceived as his repeated assurances that he would, as soon as he could, leave his wife and marry her. For Rosamond, this wasn't a casual affair. This was everything. She staked her entire future on this promise. She believed him with a desperate, all-consuming faith. This was the soulmate she had been searching for, the man who would finally heal her and make her whole. She divorced Wogan in 1944, a formal and public act that she saw as clearing the path for her new life with Cecil. She was now free. She settled in to wait for him to do the same. The 9 years that followed were a masterclass in emotional torment, a life lived in the shadows, dictated by the rhythms of his indecision. Their relationship was a chaotic cycle of passionate, stolen weekends and agonizing separations. He became a regular visitor to her home, a beloved uncle figure to her adoring children, Hugo and Sally. This created an almost unbearable atmosphere of domestic deceit. Rosamond was forced to play the part of the gracious hostess to her lover, pretending he was merely a family friend, all while her heart was screaming with the intensity of their secret. Cecil, it turned out, was a man constitutionally incapable of decisive action. He was a Hamlet figure, plagued by guilt, torn between his passion for Rosamond and his duty to his family. He loved the drama and the intellectual fire of his relationship with Rosamond, but he dreaded the messy, practical reality of divorce and scandal. He was a man, as one biographer noted, who was addicted to having his cake and eating it. So he strung her along. The years ticked by. 1945, 1946, 1947. Each year was filled with new excuses, new reasons for delay. His wife was too fragile. The boys were at a difficult age. His financial situation was precarious. Rosamond's letters from this period are heartbreaking documents of a brilliant woman gradually being worn down by hope and disappointment. They are filled with declarations of her undying love, but also with increasingly desperate pleas for him to honor his promise, to end their agonizing life in limbo. Her friends watched in horror. Her brother John, who knew Cecil well, saw the situation with brutal clarity. He warned her repeatedly that Cecil was weak, that he would never leave his wife, that Rosamond was sacrificing her life and her work on the altar of a fantasy. but she was deaf to their warnings. She was in the grip of what she would later call a great sickness, an obsessive love that had become the central organizing principle of her world. To give up on Cecil would be to admit that she had wasted the best years of her life, and that was a truth too devastating to face. And so she waited. As the 1940s drew to a close, she was a woman on a knife's edge. She was nearing 50. The affair had consumed her creative energies. She had published nothing for years. The constant stress and uncertainty had taken a physical and emotional toll. Yet still, she clung to the promise. The situation was unbearable, and she knew it had to break one way or another. She prayed for a resolution, for the moment when the secrecy would finally end and their true life together could begin. She had no idea that the resolution, when it came, would be more cruel and devastating than anything her novelist's imagination could have possibly conceived. Hope is a dangerous thing. For 9 years, it had been the fuel that Rosamond Lehmann ran on, a volatile, high-octane mixture of desire and belief. She had structured her entire world around the promise of a future with Cecil Day-Lewis. She had endured the lies, the waiting, the indignity of being the other woman, all because she was certain that their love was an epic, a story that would eventually find its happy ending. In 1949, it seemed that moment had finally miraculously arrived. The news came not from Cecil, but through the literary world's ever-efficient grapevine. Cecil's wife, Mary, had left him. The great obstacle, the woman whose fragility he had used as an excuse for nearly a decade, was gone. The path was clear. For Rosamond, this must have felt like a miracle, a reprieve from a divine authority. The years of sacrifice were about to be redeemed. We can only imagine her state of mind in the days that followed as she waited for his call. It must have been a period of almost delirious anticipation, a time when every ring of the telephone promised the start of her new life. She would have planned their future in her mind, imagined the home they would share, the relief of finally being able to love him in the open, in the full light of day. The waiting was an agony, but it was a sweet agony, because she was certain of the outcome. And then the telephone rang. That phone call would become the single most scarring emotional event of her life. It was not a conversation, it was a clinical amputation, performed without anesthetic. Cecil's voice on the other end of the line was not the voice of a lover finally free to claim his beloved. It was the cool, distant voice of a man delivering a verdict. He told her that he was indeed beginning a new life, but it would not be with her. He had fallen in love with someone else. The shock of those words must have been like a physical blow stealing the air from her lungs. But the true cruelty, the twist of the knife that would poison her for years to come, was in the details that followed. His new love was a beautiful, talented young actress named Jill Balcon, and she was 24 years old. Rosamond would later recall the devastating words he reportedly used to explain his choice. According to her account, he told her his new love was a young girl and innocent. The implication was as clear as it was brutal. Rosamond, at 48, a woman who had been his lover for 9 years, a woman who had divorced her husband for him, was neither young nor innocent. In that single, carefully chosen phrase, he dismissed their entire history. He recast their epic love story as a sordid, middle-aged affair, and painted himself as a man being reborn through the purity of a younger woman. It was a masterpiece of self-justification and a profound public humiliation for Rosamond. She was being discarded not just for a rival, but for an ideal of youth she could never reclaim. The 9 years she had devoted to him, the best years of her creative and personal life, had been rendered utterly meaningless in the space of a single telephone call. The world, as she knew it, ceased to exist. The immediate aftermath was a complete collapse. This was not the dignified heartbreak she wrote about in her novels. This was a raw, howling grief mixed with a white-hot rage and a shame that was almost unbearable. The humiliation was intensely public. Cecil Day-Lewis and Jill Balkin were soon married, becoming a celebrated literary couple. Their son, the future actor Daniel Day-Lewis, would be born a few years later. Rosamond, meanwhile, was cast in the most painful and cliché of roles, the older woman, the discarded mistress. For a writer of such fierce intelligence and pride, the indignity was a separate torture all its own. For a long time she was creatively paralyzed, lost in a fog of despair. How could she write about love when her own heart had been so comprehensively destroyed? But Rosamond Lehmann was, above all, a survivor and an artist. And an artist's job is to make sense of chaos, to transform the raw, screaming material of life into the ordered beauty of art. Slowly, painfully, she began to do the only thing she knew how. She began to write her way out of the wreckage. The result, published in 1953, was The Echoing Grove. It is widely regarded as one of her most important and complex works, a novel of staggering technical brilliance and profound psychological depth. It is not a simple revenge story. Her artistic integrity was far too great for that. Instead, she took the raw agony of her experience and refracted it through a complex, fictional prism. The novel tells the story of a love triangle, but it is primarily focused on the relationship between two sisters, Dinah and Madeline, who have both been in love with the same man, Ricky. The novel is a stunningly intricate narrative, moving backwards and forwards in time, exploring the same events from different perspectives, revealing how love, betrayal, and memory are utterly subjective. In the characters of the two sisters, Rosamond explored the warring aspects of her own self. There is the passionate, reckless, home-wrecking Dinah, and the conventional, long-suffering, but equally wounded wife Madeleine. By splitting the emotional experience between them, she was able to examine the situation from all sides, with a degree of empathy and understanding that is almost miraculous given the personal trauma that inspired it. The Echoing Grove is a devastatingly honest book about the destructive nature of romantic obsession, about the bonds and rivalries between women, and about the ghosts of a great passion that haunt the survivors long after the love itself is dead. It was her artistic triumph over her personal catastrophe. The book was hailed by critics as a major work of art. She had taken the ugliest, most painful experience of her life and forged it into something beautiful, lasting, and true. But the effort had cost her dearly. After the emotional inferno of the affair and the exhausting creative labor of The Echoing Grove, Rosamond retreated. She was emotionally scarred, wary of the world. According to her biographers, she would never again enter into another major, publicly acknowledged, romantic relationship. Her great capacity for love, once a torrent, was now channeled into a single, pure source, her children. And at the absolute center of that world was her daughter, Sally. By the mid-1950s, Sally was a young woman of extraordinary grace and vitality. She had her mother's ethereal beauty and her father's idealistic spirit, but she possessed a warmth and an emotional directness that was all her own. She was intelligent, empathetic, and full of a joyous love for life. For Rosamond, Sally was more than just a daughter. She was her closest friend, her deepest confidant, the anchor that had held her steady through the worst storms of her life. Their bond was exceptionally, almost symbiotically, close. In Sally, Rosamond saw all her hopes for a future free from the romantic wreckage of her own past. Sally was her proof that a life of happiness and uncomplicated love was possible. In 1957, Sally married a handsome young diplomat named Patrick de Courcy Ireland. It was a happy, promising match, and Rosamond was overjoyed. The following year, the young couple prepared for their first major diplomatic posting, Jakarta, Indonesia. For Rosamond, their departure was bittersweet. The thought of Sally being on the other side of the world filled her with a mother's natural anxiety, but this was overwhelmed by a sense of pride and excitement for the great adventure her daughter was about to begin. Life settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the slow pace of airmail. Letters flew back and forth between Oxfordshire and Jakarta. Long, detailed, affectionate letters filled with Sally's vivid descriptions of her new life in a strange and exotic country, and Rosamond's news from home. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Sally was happy, healthy, and thriving. Then in November of 1958, the normal world was shattered. A telegram arrived. It was from Sally's husband, Paddy. The words on the flimsy piece of paper were stark and terrifying. Sally was ill. She had been diagnosed with poliomyelitis. Polio. In the 1950s, before the vaccine became widespread, it was one of the most feared words in the English language. A terrifying and unpredictable disease that could lead to paralysis, respiratory failure, and death. Rosamond was plunged into a state of frantic, primal terror. She had to get to her. She had to be by her daughter's side. But the world of 1958 was not the world of today. There was no hopping on a 24-hour flight. And journey to Indonesia was a complex, multi-day affair. She was trapped, thousands of miles away in an agony of helplessness. Her life shrank to the four walls of her room, her entire existence focused on the telephone, waiting for news, praying for a miracle. She was suspended in that terrible, timeless void of waiting, a void filled with every conceivable prayer and every imaginable fear. She was a mother, waiting for word of her child, suspended between hope and the unthinkable. And the unthinkable was already on its way. In the landscape of human suffering, there is a particular terror reserved for waiting. It is a state of paralysis, a helpless purgatory between the known and the unknown. For days, Rosamond Lehmann existed in this void. Trapped thousands of miles from her daughter, she could do nothing but wait for the next crackle of the telephone line, the next knock of the telegram boy. She was suspended between a desperate, prayerful hope and the encroaching shadow of the unthinkable. Then the second telegram came. There is no way to adequately describe the impact of such a message. It is not news. It is a demolition. The few simple words transmitted across the wire that her beloved Sally, her vibrant 24-year-old daughter, was dead, did not just break Rosamond's heart. They detonated the entire foundation of her world. The grief that descended upon her was not the familiar, manageable sorrow she had written about in her novels. It was a monolithic alien force, a physical presence that blotted out the sun and silenced every other thought and feeling. Her friends, when they were allowed to see her, found a woman they no longer recognized. The writer Sybil Bedford described her as a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a person, moving through her house as if it were a tomb. The world-renowned novelist, the master cartographer of the human heart, was gone. In her place was simply a mother whose child had died, a pain so absolute and primal it defied language. This event marked a profound turning point in Rosamond Lehmann's literary life. Her great subject had always been the intricacies of romantic love, which now seemed trivial. The creative wellspring that had produced her great novels was, for the most part, frozen solid. While she did not publish another major novel, she channeled her experience into the powerful memoir spiritual exploration, The Swan in the Evening, 1967. Though her fiction output largely ceased, the great artist was not entirely silenced, but rather found a new, more private voice to articulate her pain. But the mother, the woman whose entire being was entwined with her daughters, could not be silenced. She had to find a way to survive, and survival meant finding Sally. If her daughter no longer existed in the physical world, Rosamond would have to find her somewhere else. Her journey into the world of spiritualism, a path that would baffle and embarrass many of her rational, intellectual friends, was not a descent into madness. For her, it was the only sane and logical step. The idea that the intense, powerful, living bond of love she shared with Sally could simply be switched off by a biological event was, to Rosamond, the truly insane proposition. The connection had to endure. It had to. Her new reality was built around a single, extraordinary experience that she would later detail in her own account, the strange and heartbreaking book called The Swan in the Evening. In her telling, on the very night of Sally's death in Jakarta, thousands of miles away and before any news had reached her, she was suddenly awakened from a state of deep anxiety by an overwhelming, inexplicable wave of pure, ecstatic joy. It was, she wrote, a feeling of absolute fulfillment, a transcendent bliss unlike anything she had ever known. In this state, she had a powerful vision of a swan, a symbol that had long held personal significance for her. When the news of Sally's death arrived, this experience was retroactively transformed. It was not a strange dream. It was a message. From that moment on, she became utterly convinced that it was Sally's spirit, freed from her failing body, rushing to her mother to share her joy and to let her know that she was safe, that death was not an end, but a glorious transition. For Rosamond, this vision of the swan became the cornerstone of her new faith, what she considered the unshakable proof that her daughter's consciousness had not been extinguished. From that point on, her life became a singular quest to deepen and continue that communication. She plunged headlong into the world of spiritualism, attending seances with mediums and practicing automatic writing for hours on end. She filled notebooks with what she firmly believed were messages from Sally, dictated from the afterlife. These were not vague, comforting platitudes. They were, in Rosamond's telling, detailed, articulate, and deeply personal conversations. Sally, she reported, described the world she now inhabited, reassured her mother of her profound happiness, and reaffirmed again and again that their love was an eternal bond that death was powerless to break. To the outside world, this was a profound embarrassment. Many of her friends, steeped in the secular intellectual traditions of Bloomsbury, were appalled. They saw a brilliant mind shattered by grief, succumbing to the comforting fantasies of charlatans and wishful thinking. They mourned the loss of the great novelist and shook their heads at the strange, mystical old woman she was becoming. But Rosamond was impervious to their skepticism. What did their rational disbelief matter in the face of her experienced reality? They had not lost a child. They had not felt that ecstatic visitation. She had found her daughter again. For her, that was the only truth that mattered. The decades that followed were a long, quiet diminuendo. She sold the house in the countryside, the scene of both her greatest joys and her deepest sorrows, and began to live a much quieter, more private life in her London home. Her public life was over. The literary world, with its shifting fashions, quickly moved on. In the 1960s, the era of the angry young men, a new generation of writers emerged who prized gritty social realism. Rosamond's lyrical, intensely feminine, and psychologically focused novels were dismissed as relics of a bygone era, sentimental, privileged, and irrelevant. She was now, in every sense, the swan out of favor, a forgotten queen reigning over a silent private kingdom of memories and spirits. But history has a way of circling back, of rediscovering the treasures it has carelessly discarded. In the 1970s and 80s, the rise of the feminist movement and the founding of publishing houses like Virago Press, which was dedicated to reprinting lost classics by women, sparked a major Rosamond Lehmann revival. A new generation of readers, unbothered by the literary fashions of the previous decades, discovered her work. They found in her novels a fearless, timeless, and profoundly relevant exploration of female experience. They saw her not as a writer of dated romances, but as a courageous pioneer who had mapped the hidden continents of women's inner lives. This late-life rediscovery brought her a final gentle wave of public recognition. In 1982, she was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. She gave occasional television interviews, appearing as a figure of immense, almost regal dignity. She was still strikingly beautiful, but her famous dark eyes now held a deep, unshakable sadness, the look of someone who had seen too much. She spoke of her daughter and her spiritual beliefs with a calm, unwavering, and matter-of-fact conviction that was unnerving in its sincerity. She had found a kind of peace, but it was a peace forged on the far side of an unimaginable inferno. Rosamond Lehmann died in 1990, at the age of 89. She had outlived her siblings, her lovers, her critics, and by more than 30 years, her beloved daughter. She had been in turn a dazzling prodigy, a literary superstar, a heartbroken mistress, a forgotten relic, and finally, a rediscovered icon. So what do we take away from the tumultuous, tragic, and triumphant life of Rosamond Lehmann? We remember the dazzling talent, the Swan who conquered the literary world with the sheer force of her emotional honesty. We remember the passionate, reckless heart that led her into such profound ecstasy and such devastating sorrow. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of her life is about resilience, not the loud, defiant kind, but a quieter, stranger, and perhaps more profound kind of survival. Her story is a powerful and at times painful reminder that the most beautiful and graceful surfaces can hide the deepest and most dangerous fractures. It teaches us that a life can be both a spectacular success and a heartbreaking tragedy, all at once. She lived a life of almost unbearable feeling and paid an immense price for it. But her art was her alchemy, the way she transformed that pain into something beautiful and true. She was a writer who dared to insist that the inner lives of women, their desires, their friendships, their secret sorrows, were not small or trivial things, but were in fact the very axis on which the world turned. And in the end, she was a mother whose love for her child was so powerful, so absolute, that she refused to let even the finality of death have the last word. The Swan may have been cast out by the world, but in the unseen kingdom of her own making, she never ever stopped singing her haunting, beautiful, and unforgettable song.